writing, they wrote that the exact duration of therapy cannot be deduced reliably from a trial with the design of cure, and the only way to reliably estimate the exact length of therapy that various treatments in any condition should be given by prospectively randomizing patient to various treatment durations, followed most likely by any type of single antiplatelet therapy, reduces bleeding and CV death. Hi everyone, my name is Marco Valgimigli. I'm a Deputy Chief of Cardiocentro Ticino Institute in Lugano, Switzerland, and I would like to take this opportunity to discuss with you briefly why I think the current EOC 2023 recommendation on a default 12-month DPT duration is profoundly wrong, and why I hope this recommendation will be improved in the upcoming guidelines version. These are my disclosures, and this is the starting point for my consideration, for my talk. As you may know, the 2023 ESC guidelines on acute coronary syndromes were using really for the very first time the default terminology when DPT duration of 12 months was recommended. And very surprisingly, this is the only Class 1 recommendation for DPT duration within the guidelines. Now, we do have in this document some so-called alternative antiplatelet treatment strategies to reduce the bleeding risk, and they have been labeled either with a Class 2B or 2A, in a way alluding to the fact that they may be really something to be considered beyond 12 months, but really 12 months is the only Class 1 indication. So an inherent message in these guidelines, which I profoundly disagree with, is that since these two individual patients have had the same disease, namely an acute coronary syndrome, despite the fact that they do differ dramatically for multiple reasons, including age, sex, and many others, the default antiplatelet treatment strategy should be the same, meaning 1 year, 12-month DPT duration. While this is in a way very surprising for many reasons, and I will be discussing this, if anything, because this is also at least partially contradicting the messages that the same European Society of Cardiology guidelines were issuing in the previous guidelines version. In the prior EOC guidelines, the terminology was first, the default terminology has never been used before, and secondly, the recommendations stated as following: DPT duration should be individualized based on ischemic and bleeding risk, or an alternative expression to formulate pretty much a similar concept, namely the need for individualizing DPT duration was DPT duration should be that long unless concerns over bleeding prevail. Now, this terminology has all of a sudden disappeared in the latest ESC guidelines, and the default terminology again has been introduced, which is a very strong way of saying DPT should last for 1 year, namely 12 months in every single patient because of an ACS. Now, interestingly, the most recent 2025 American guidelines were even more liberal than the ESC guidelines in recommending a short DPT duration. And I have to say, I have to commend the ACC AHA guidelines, which stated and provided for the very first time a Class 1A recommendation for a very short DPT duration regimen in patients with ACS. The recommendation states that in patients with ACS who have tolerated DPT with ticagrelor, transition to ticagrelor monotherapy starting from 1 month after PCI onwards is useful to reduce the bleeding risk. And this is really a very important and new recommendation, which in a way should, I think, valued more than 1 year DPT. Why am I saying this? Well, because the 12-month DPT duration is in fact a full myth, because that has never been supported by real data. The guidelines kept recommending this DPT duration based on 3 studies, namely CURE, TRITON, and PLATO. Now, I cannot disagree more on this approach because these 3 studies in no way can and should support 12-month DPT. Let's look quickly through these three studies together. In CURE, first, clopidogrel was given for an average of 3 to 12 months, with the mean treatment duration of 9 months on top of aspirin versus aspirin alone. So in fact, the studies was not about DAPT duration, but was DAPT versus non-DAPT. And only a minority of patients, roughly 38% of patients, who were allocated to the DAPT group really received the treatment for truly 1 year. Now, even the CURE investigators themselves were commenting upon this hot topic, and in writing, they wrote that the exact duration of therapy cannot be deduced reliably from a trial with the design of CURE, and the only way to reliably estimate the exact length of therapy that various treatments in any condition should be given by prospectively randomizing patients to various treatment durations, which is not what the study has done. Now, the other two studies which are frequently quoted to support the 1 year DPT duration are Triton and Plato. Interestingly, these are type, not duration DAPT studies, and in none of these two studies, the average or mean DAPT duration was 1 year. In fact, it was either 15 months in Triton and 9 months of Plato. So in no way these three studies would be able to support the 1 year DAPT duration set forth by the guidelines. Recently, we published a meta-analysis of DAPT duration studies, which we do have nowadays. And in fact, especially in high bleeding risk patients, this meta-analysis was showing that a shorter than 1 year DPT would not only reduce the risk of bleeding, as you may expect, but would interestingly also associate it with the lower risk of CV death compared to 1 year DPT. So I would submit to you, I would really discuss with you that the default DPT duration for sure in high bleeding risk patients should not be 12 months, rather 1 or up to 3 month DPT duration, which is what has been tested in these studies, and that is what has been associated with the cardiovascular mortality reduction. What about the non-high bleeding risk patients, where here the focus should not only be on DPT duration per se, but also on what type of single antiplatelet therapy is continued after this short DAPT duration phase. If the single antiplatelet therapy continue this aspirin, we do have data suggesting that in especially acute coronary syndrome patients in whom the bleeding risk is not selected, a prolongation of DPT beyond 6 months is probably beneficial to protect patients from the risk of recurrent MI. So in this case, aspirin monotherapy alone may not be enough. Similar data have been produced with respect to clopidogrel monotherapy option. If clopidogrel monotherapy is implemented very early on, meaning early after only 1 month of DPT, we do have data, again, in patients with acute coronary syndrome, that these single antiplatelet treatment strategies, again, constituted by clopidogrel, may not be enough to protect from the risk of recurrent myocardial infarction. Although, of course, it does reduce the risk of bleeding compared to a dual antiplatelet treatment strategies. However, we do have data, and this is what the American guidelines is about, showing that if ticagrelor monotherapy is implemented after the short DPT duration phase, which in this pooled analysis was from 2 weeks to 3 months, ticagrelor monotherapy was in fact associated with non-inferiority with respect to prolongation of DPT up to 1 year. This monotherapy approach was associated with more than 50% lower risk of major bleeding complications, And importantly again, the short DAPT regimen followed by ticagrelor monotherapy was also in this pooled analysis focusing on non-HBR patients together with HBR patients, was associated with a lower risk of all-cause death. So once again, emphasizing the fact that if we walk away from 1 year DAPT, which is not based on evidence, and we would embrace a short DAPT regimen, depending on the type of single antiplatelet therapy and depending on the type of patient population, there is room not only for cutting the bleeding risk by more than half, but even improving fatal endpoints, which is extraordinarily important for us to be aware of. And especially in the CS patient, these results were deemed to be definitive at trial sequential analysis. So to sum up what I was discussing with you, in high bleeding risk patients, we do have evidence that 1 to 3 months DAPT, followed most likely by any type of single antiplatelet therapy, reduces bleeding and CV death. In both HBR and non-HBR, the type of single antiplatelet therapy matters, and with that respect, ticagrelor, which is most likely only a reliable P2Y12 inhibitor, unlike clopidogrel, and in a way unlike aspirin, has really the chance to again reduce not only the bleeding risk, but also overall mortality. So again, I do not understand the position taken by these 2023 guidelines, reinforcing this default 1 year DAPT regimen, which is associated to higher bleeding risk and in many instances also mortality risk. With that said, I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to additional opportunity to discuss new topics with you. Thank you very much.
If you have comments or questions, please post them in the comment box. Our experts will reply, and the channel secretariat will share their feedback.